So this talk, I want to talk about the cryosphere. And let's see. So what is the cryosphere? The cryosphere, you have the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the cryosphere. So they're all different components of the Earth, and the Earth is a sphere. So the term cryosphere refers to basically all of the frozen water on the Earth at a given moment, and so that obviously has different forms. If it's forming on, I'll just see, yeah, if it's forming on the top of a mountain, then it becomes a glacier or an ice cap. If it's just snow, that's another form of ice. You have the sea ice. You have these ice sheets, which are very large masses, and technically, according to glaciologists, use the term ice age when there is at least one permanent ice sheet in both hemispheres. So at the moment, we are still in an ice age because we have ice sheets on Antarctica and in Greenland. But we're in an interglacial period, so which is quite pleasant relative to a glacial maximum. Okay, permafrost is defined as if you have the temperature of the ground is permanently below zero for more than a year, then any water that is in the soil is frozen, and so it's permafrost. So let's look at it. Where is the cryosphere? So as I mentioned, you have these ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland. We also have a lot of glaciers in high altitudes, so you have Tibet and all along the Andes, and also at high altitudes and high latitudes. We also have sea ice, the Antarctic sea ice and the Arctic sea ice, and permafrost are these regions up along Siberia and Canada, Alaska. And we have the bits in light green are regions which are snow cover, so we get seasonal snow. And the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, many people are relying on their summary of the literature for making their assessments on climate change. And what I would point out is when you read these reports, I've noticed they're very good at identifying any trends that imply the ice is melting dramatically. But if you're interested in climate science and climate change, you should really be looking at all of the trends, not just the ones that fit your narrative. You should be looking for the bits that fit your narrative and that disagree with your narrative. Science is about trying to find the full picture. And so this was in the 5th assessment report, which is the main bulky reports which are done every 6 to 7 years. And the last one was in 2013 to 2014. That's the 5th assessment report. And in the summary for policymakers of Working Group 1, this is what they said. I won't read it out there, but they're focusing on last 2 decades. Greenland, Antarctic ice sheets have been losing mass, glaciers shrinking worldwide, Arctic sea ice, notice no mention of Antarctic. Northern Hemisphere spring snow cover have continued to decline. And just a few weeks ago, the IPCC also did a supplementary report, a special report, which is the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's a very, relevant stuff here. Yeah, so I've published here 3 papers, peer-reviewed papers, related to different aspects of the cryosphere, as well as other work that they're doing. And if you want to go to my website here, ronanconnellyscience.com, it has links to all of the papers, and that's the most up-to-date lists of what's there. So You can get links to those preprints to that as well, to those papers as well. So I'm going to split this up into trying to cover all of the aspects of the cryosphere. And mostly I will be focusing on the northern hemisphere. That's where most of my research will be going. But I will also put in a little finish with some brief discussion on Antarctica. And we'll start with the Arctic sea ice. So sea ice, every year, as we go into the winter in each hemisphere, the sea ice grows, and then in the summer it melts. So we have this cyclical alternation between the two periods. Obviously, the southern hemisphere, the seasons are reversed, so you get, when you have a low sea ice in the Arctic, you have a high sea ice in the Antarctic, and vice versa. But if we look at across all seasons, since satellite records began in 1978, there's been a general long-term decline across all seasons in Arctic sea ice extent. Now, I'm going to talk quite a bit about in this talk about the CMIP5 global climate model. So I'll just talk a little bit about this. The IPCC reports rely heavily on computer models, what are called global climate models, or GCMs for short. And my PhD was actually in computer modeling in a different field in polymer physics before I moved into climate change. And I have a high regard for computer models. They're a very important part of science. But you have to remember, models shouldn't be used as a replacement for actual observations. We need to, with our models, we should use them for trying to understand what the observations are telling us and what they're giving us, insights they're giving about what's actually happening. And so it's very important, I feel, to compare what your models are saying should be occurring with what is actually happening. So for the IPCC fifth assessment report, there's like, I think 23 climate modeling groups, and they all submitted for the CMIP5 project their simulations of the Earth, of the Earth's climate. And as part of that, they use what are called hindcasts. So a forecast, we're all familiar, is where you're predicting what will happen in the future. But a hindcast is the opposite. So they go back in time and they say, if we were back in time, can we forecast what our models say should have occurred? So when I say hindcast, what I'm saying is this is what the computer models say should have occurred. Now, for the talk, I'm just going to focus on mainly what are called the multi-model means. But if you read in the papers, we talk more about internal variability and different aspects. So this is just the big picture. If you want to find out more about the details, you should read the papers and do it. But here's the point. The climate models that were submitted to the IPCC fifth assessment report, when you average them all together, they say, over the same period, they say, yes, it should have declined. But they actually find that the area, this is sea ice area, should have been declining a lot quicker. And also, you can see there's quite a bit of up and down here, whereas the models aren't really detecting the same up and down. And some might say this is the internal variability of them. I won't go on to that too much here. But when we do the same for the Antarctic sea ice, you can see maybe why the IPCC didn't mention the Antarctic sea ice trends in their summary for policymakers. The models, some people were saying, oh, the last 2 or 3 years were below average. Yes, but even still, the long-term trend has been an increase. And the models were saying it should have been decreasing. Yeah. So, but let's gloss over that inconvenience. What about before the satellite? The IPCC again, they use you do see references to a pre-satellite estimates. This was developed by, basically it's Walsh and Chapman. You have different variants, but it's basically from this guy here, John Walsh and Chapman. They did this estimate. Now, you can see almost a straight line, a few squiggles up and down. As soon as they switch to satellite, you get this rapid decline. Now, how are they calculating the pre-satellite estimates? Well, it turns out that, yeah, if the satellites is the best, there are problems with that because they're not direct measurements of sea ice, it's complexities, but they cover most of the hemisphere, of each of the hemispheres. They have a lot of a good coverage. But before that, there are shipping records, there are aerial reconnaissance measurements, and there's a lot of different information. And so what we've done here, and what we've done is we've taken Walsh and Chapman's, this was a paper we did in 2017. We took Walsh and Chapman's data, and we also took other data sources that had been digitized more recently. And this was the main data source for the original Walsh and Chapman. They relied quite heavily on these sea ice charts that were done by the Danish Meteorological Institute. And they have these charts. They would issue them every month. This is for August 1952. Do you see, I don't know if you can see it there, but there's these little red dots there. Can anybody see that there's some bits that are covered in red? Yeah. That's places where they had measurements. No measurements here. So what they said is, I suppose it. But they didn't know, but no evidence. And I guess if you wanted to be conservative, if you're saying, look, if anybody is traveling around the Arctic, assume there might be ice there. But meanwhile, the problem was, this of course was during the Cold War. So the Europeans and Americans were not having a lot of communication with the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union, they were looking at their side as well. So they were taking regular aerial reconnaissance. So this is for the same month. This is the Russian data for aerial reconnaissance. And you can see the blue regions here were mostly ice-free over that month. And if you compare the same region here, Walsh and Chapman had it ice-filled. So on their guesses, the measurements were showing ice-free. So what we did is we realized you have a lot of different instruments, different things. How do you do changing from aerial estimates to sea or to ocean or like ship measurements to station measurements? What we realized is that there was different changes in things in the data sources. So in this paper we did in 2017, we took all of the sources and we recalibrated each of them so that they had the same expected response in terms of related to the Arctic temperature records which we had. And when we had done all of that, this was Walsh's, I'm just showing here summer, because this is the one that's the most dramatic according to these previous things. You see not really much and then suddenly here, and you see some very flat periods as well. This is what we're finding is our current best estimate of what happened to Arctic sea ice, going back to 1901. And you can see up, down, and hindcasts that I was mentioning. We showed that for the sea ice, for the satellite era. So the satellite era is the bit from 1978. If we take our hindcasts and go all the way back to 1901, they're saying pretty much nothing happened, and then suddenly CO2 is increasing and causing unusual dramatic global warming, and so the sea ice should have, according in the computer model world, the sea ice started falling off. In the real world, we're finding not a whole lot. We're finding a lot more variability. And I just got to show you here the annual trends. So, look, the error bars are quite large. We have to acknowledge that. Scientists should be paying more attention to saying when there are uncertainties with the data. And but despite that, we can see a general growth for the early 20th century, which implies Arctic cooling. And then you had melt up to the 40s, and then you had sea ice growth, and then sea ice decline. And of course, the satellites only started in 1978, so they missed the melt growth, and they started just at the start of 40 years of Arctic melting. And so then it seems a lot more dramatic. Their new special report, how do they describe it? They don't really. This is in the summary for policymakers. The report goes into a bit more detail, but this is the takeaway messages that the IPCC authors felt were most important. Between 1979 and 2008, Arctic sea ice showed a September sea ice reduction. I hope you now see that was, if you look further back, that followed sea ice expansion, sea ice reduction, sea ice expansion. And what about the Antarctic? Oh, well, we have this little Antarctic sea ice extent overall has now had no statistically significant trend due to contrasting regional signals and large interannual variability. At least they mentioned that. They didn't in the summary policy makers for the fifth assessment report. But can we go back any further? Well, this isn't my work. This work here, but I think it's quite a fascinating and interesting concept. It was built on the work. There was Professor Simon Belt and his colleagues in 2007 noticed a particular type of protein, which is called IP25 for short. That's produced by a type of algae that grows on sea ice. And when the sea ice melts, it falls down to the ocean floor. So if you were to dig a sediment core there, you can see, oh, we had seasonal sea ice. What if you don't have IP25 though? That gives you, it could either be because the sea ice is permanent there, it remained there completely, and so the protein or the algae couldn't sink, or maybe there was no sea ice at all, it was ice free, in which case the algae wouldn't grow. So this has been more recently saying by combining the IP25 with phytoplankton estimates. Phytoplankton doesn't grow well under permanent sea ice because there's not enough light. So if you look at the sea ice core, or in the sediment cores down in the ocean, and you have low IP25 and low phytoplankton, that implies that there was permanent sea ice cover at that time. If at a later period you find high IP25, you say, oh, it's seasonal. That means in the summer it melted, but then it came back in the winter. If it's low IP25 and you have high phytoplankton, that means it was mostly ice-free. So that's, yeah. Here, this is from Rudiger Stein et al. Paper. They studied it. They've compared 4 ocean sediment cores. And I want you to see they are from different regions. This is the region where Nicholas was talking about earlier with the Gulf Stream. But you can see here on the along the Russian Arctic, we have, and this is getting close towards the Canadian Arctic. So you have it spread throughout the different regions. The 4 cores. This is September 2015 sea ice cover. So you can see in the winter, these 3 ice cores, or sediment cores, were in regions that were covered with sea ice. But in the spring, or in the summer, the ice has disappeared. So these are seasonal sea ice. The Fram Strait was ice-free in the winter and in the summer. So that's permanently ice-free. Today, let's go back in time with these, according to these sediment cores. This is going back to 6 or 8,000 BC. And you can see for each of the cores, at the top, on the this is 4 different cores, and the top of the axis indicates permanent ice. The bottom indicates it was mostly ice-free. And you can see this is present and this is the past. If we look at, we have, as I mentioned, we've three of the locations have seasonal ice and the other is ice-free today. During the Bronze Age, actually Fram Strait seemed to have had seasonal ice, but 2 of the other regions, Chukchi and East Siberian, seem to have been mostly ice-free. They were down here. Sorry, that one there. And now 6,000 BC, all 4 of them were mostly ice-free. So that means, if this is correct, all 4 of those locations, which were spread throughout the Arctic, they all had, it implies that there was a lot less ice coverage during around 6,000 BC than today. And also that it might have been less sea ice coverage during the Bronze Age. There is the complexity of Fram switching. So it might have been a different overall pattern, a shape. Maybe some regions had more and some had less. But certainly 6,000 BC seemed to have been less sea ice, according to that sea ice proxy. So snow cover. Let's go back to the IPCC 5th Assessment Report. Over the last 2 decades, Northern Hemisphere spring snow cover has continued to decline in extent. Specifically for the summer or spring, over the 1967 to 2012 period, it has declined. And they show this graph for the Northern Hemisphere spring snow cover. I'll come back to that later. Notice, why do they focus on just the 1967 to 2012 linear trend for spring snow cover? Also notice they didn't really bring any attention to the computer models in the summary for policymakers here. So why not the winter and autumn? Autumn or fall, depending on whether you're European or American, I guess. Okay. These are the observed satellite estimates of snow cover, Northern Hemisphere snow cover. This is the hindcast multi-model mean for the same metric. And you can see it should have been declining. According to, in the computer model world, it was declining because of an increasing CO2. In the real world, down, up. Down and up. And also that was a very specific time period to be evaluating. They were using, so for spring, there are some pre-satellite estimates from different ground measurements. And they only have enough data for the spring, but Brown and Robinson decided they tried to get it back. The IPCC showed that graph, slightly differently plotted, but it's the same data. But they focused on that specific trend when it was declining. If they'd looked at the trend up till then, it would have been increasing. And coincidentally, the last couple of years, it's increased as well. Annual we're getting, you see the way it was above average in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. Then it was below average. And but it seemed to have been almost like a step change there in the late 80s. The model world is saying it should have been continually declining. They have updated it for the for this September report that was just published. Arctic June. It used to be spring. Now we're just looking at June. And they've said 1967 to 2018 has decreased. They're more interested now in the models. I guess the models give them a cleaner answer. So that seems to have been what the report writers felt was worth focusing on. Yes, so temperature trends are relevant for both permafrost and also for the ice sheets and Greenland. And so this is taken from the 2017 paper, but it was an update of an analysis we did in a 2015 paper. And what we find is this is using all rural stations, so not affected by urban heat islands problems or anything like that, north of 60 degrees north. And you can see Arctic warming up to the 30s and 40s, then Arctic cooling. Satellite records kick in just as we've gone from Arctic cooling to Arctic warming. We can say for definite that this early warm period had nothing to do with CO2 because our greenhouse gas forcing, because the IPCC records confirmed that CO2 was only 0.03%, and the pre-industrial was 0.029%. So we need to be able to, before we can say what this is due to, it is important to figure out why was it warming then and cooling then. In the paper we did, in the 2015 paper, we do suggest that one of the estimates of solar variability matches very well with that. So that's, if anyone's interested, that could be an explanation. But we also showed that there's 8 different estimates of solar forcing. So, you know, pick and choose. I will say, if there's anybody is familiar with the Arctic temperature records, we are trying to do a follow-on study. A big problem is, and this is part of why we have uncertainties with the early parts of the data, is these are the numbers of stations going back to the first Arctic one in the 1830s. You can see we've huge numbers of stations between 1950 and 1990. But if we want to look at the long-term pictures, you see there's going down, there's not as many for the early 20th century. And there's been changes in the types of stations that are in operation. And if you take any given station, there are a lot of potential non-climatic biases. And the NOAA is a group that compiles temperatures. A lot of the groups run computer programs to try and automatically correct for these non-climatic biases. But we really need to see what do the meteorologists that were in charge of those weather stations, what records do they have of any changes that might have occurred? So we are trying to build on that in a later thing. In the meantime, Greenland is one of the most data-rich parts of the Arctic in terms of temperature records, and I'm just going to show you some of the results from, this is the Danish Meteorological Institute, just did a compilation of these different data or weather stations. And that, of course, is the Northern Hemisphere's permanent ice sheet. And I just quickly looked through them, but notice, blue is below average, red is above average. I don't know if you can see the temperatures or the years, but this one is from 1873 to present, 1895 to present. You see you had this warm period in the 30s and 40s, then a cool period, another warm period now, and that's same there. And the warm period there for Greenland was comparable in the 30s to present. Again, we have the same thing. You can, sometimes you have a blip up there, or you have a blip down there, but broadly you're seeing warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm. The same again, and so that's it. So to just talk of the temperature records, the sea ice satellite records that I mentioned, it only starts in 1978. For the Arctic, that coincided with the end of Arctic cooling and it transitioned to Arctic warming. Most of the permafrost records actually only began in the 1990s. There are some that could go back further, but the actual direct permafrost, most of the ones are actually start quite late. And the ice sheet satellite mass balance ones, such as GRACE, they started in 2003. So in that sense, the Arctic temperature records are probably one of our better methods for studying the long-term things. So just in that, I'm just going to give you some of these 2 3-ring proxy estimates for the region. This is from 30 degrees north to 30 to 90 degrees north, summer temperatures. And there are a lot of problems with 3-ring proxies, and that's a whole other talk. But notice, they have again warming, cooling, warming. And look at that trend there that coincides with the bit that we were looking at earlier on. And now compare it to what's happened in the past. You can see this one suggests a similar warm period here, a similar warm period here, and in between you have cold periods. But this doesn't look particularly dramatic in that context to me. And here's another estimate. This is just for northern Scandinavia, but that includes Norway here. And you can see, again, you have this mid-20th century peak and a little peak thing, and this doesn't go up to exactly to present, but you can see they're similar, but you have cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm going back. It seems to be occurring. How are we doing? Okay. Yeah, okay. I'll go to glaciers next. I don't know if the sound was going to work on this, would it? Yeah, well, I'll try. So I saw this was on one of the blogs, and a guy, Dr. Roger Roots, he noticed that his local Glacier National Park had this diorama on display, and I don't know if it works. If we can try... okay, it doesn't seem to be working. Okay, the diorama showed a sign saying that, oh, what's happened? Oh, it's gone, it didn't like that. It's been deleted again. Okay, there was a sign up there that showed that all the glaciers in the park would be gone by 2020. And they showed where it would be, and the computer model projections. The sign was up there until at least September 2018. It's been taken down. The problem is, I'll talk briefly about glaciers, but there is a major problem. We don't have that much data. We have some that go back to the 1600s, and we'll just talk about it, the things, but notice that most of them only cover the period from about 1850 up to present. And so this is from Leckerlek and Orlemans. That's one of the most comprehensive data sets that's been digitized. And the other point is, Professor, a lot of you have heard of the term, I know that it was mentioned earlier, the Little Ice Age. So this seems to have been a term that seems to have been popularized by Professor Jean Grove, who used it to describe, she was finding lots of evidence around the world that glaciers were advancing from about 1600 to the late 19th century. And so she used the term, said it's the Little Ice Age. So if they were advancing up to 1900, how much of the trend since then is a reversal of that. It's very difficult to know. If we had more data, we could at least do it, but there really isn't a lot of data. I'm taking a sidestep. This is from a paper, Connolly and Connolly, 2015. In it, we developed a new estimate of Northern Hemisphere trends using only rural stations. And we took it from 4 regions where we felt we had enough data to do with enough long temperature records, so we could do a long-term estimates. This is how that compares. This is our estimate for the Northern Hemisphere land going back to 1881. And this is the standard estimate that it's the average of NASA, NOAA, CRU, Berkeley Earth, and Lugina et al. So all of them show the same trend. These use urban and rural stations. They argue that the urban heat island, some of the groups argue that the urban heat island is a negligible problem. Others argue that when you run the data through their homogenization program, that it magically removes this effect. And there's a lot of literature in that. It's an ongoing debate, and we've been saying that we don't think that that was correct, what the arguments that they're making. But it's well-meaning. I don't want to criticize the people who are believing this, in that there are papers saying it. Nonetheless, if you look at this, notice you have the ups and downs. Our one is a little noisier because we were only using rural data. They had the benefit of using all stations. It didn't matter whether it was urban or rural. We tried to stick to it. But you can see we have ups and downs are kind of similar. But this big warm period in the 1930s and 40s is far more warmer than it was there. And the cooling period in the 60s and 70s is far colder than this. So there is a question, which one is more reliable? And in that, we said, well, let's look at other ones. And the reason that I'm mentioning it is we decided to compare it with the glacier length derived estimates. And you see the yellow, that's the glacier length ones. And you can see they've quite large error bars. And what we're pointing out, just want to point out, is that the rural trends, in the glacier records, they show a warm period in the 20s and in the 30s and 40s, and a cool period in the 60s and 70s. And they show that the modern one is not too different from the 40s. So it's consistent with the rural. It's also consistent with the urban. But nonetheless, we can see glaciers retreated from the 1900s to the 40s. They advanced from 50s to 70s, and they've been retreating since. But what was it like before the 1900s? Well, you can see there's very few that have going very far back. We really don't know, but finally I will try and finish up with Antarctic. And just to remind you, expectations versus reality. The computer model world, the real world. Let's see, I don't know, this is another video, so this may destroy it. But some people say, oh, the Antarctic, you're saying the Antarctic slightly increased sea ice, but what about all these ice sheets collapsing that we've heard so much about? And it's true, this is the Larsen B ice sheet. I don't know if it'll play. Yeah, the new report tells us acceleration of ice flow and retreat in Antarctica is observed in the Amundsen Sea embayment of West Antarctica and in Wilkes Land, East Antarctica. Now, I'm going to focus more on West Antarctica, which is where the Larsen beating is. Some of you that read Nature magazine that actually get the full thing might have seen this cover showing in 2009, showing big red hot. Everywhere is heating. This was from the Steig et al. Reconstruction. And there was a group of several bloggers decided they would investigate it. So this is Ryan O'Donnell, Steve McIntyre, Jeff Condon, and I think Nick Lewis, I think, were involved in it. So the four, maybe I'm leaving out somebody, but they decided to get the data and reproduce what they were doing. And what they realized, the Ike et al. Reconstruction, what they realized is there's this period here, this place here, where there is warming. This is the West Antarctica Peninsula. If you're trying to place it geographically, here's the tip of South America, you know, so you could, you know, the little bit that's opposite Tierra del Fuego. That bit seems to be warming since 1950s. But what they, O'Donnell et al. Realized is that the reconstruction method that Steig et al. Was using was spreading the warmth from there around the entire continent. And so what we find here is this is their when O'Donnell et al. Went back and they said, well, what's the raw data saying? They said over these two specific periods, they found all these big blue regions. And you see little bits of big red blotch there and some yellow there and red there. So this is the point. And the light colours there are almost no statistically significant trend. But notice this point here, red, big hot red thing. I'm just saying this, I'm a bit dubious about this. You will see some discussion, but it is worth noting that they have discovered a lot of volcanic activity in some of these regions that is under the ice sheets. So it's plausible that that could be a fact, but really I think more work will need to be done to doing it. But just to show, we don't know what's going on. But here is the Larsen sea ice sheets. Larsen B was the one that we were talking about that got all the attention. Larsen A broke up about 8000 BC, and then it seems to have grown back about 2000 BC, and then it seemed to have collapsed in 1995. So there's some complex dynamics going on there on millennial scales. Larsen B seems to have been there while A was gone, but then it, as we said, it collapsed in 2002. Larsen C is the largest one of them all, and it seems to have been fairly stable. There was a iceberg A68 broke off in July 2007, and that was very large, but it seems the consensus from a lot of the Antarctic glaciologists are saying that it seems to have been a natural calving event. And Larsen D, this big long one here, seems to have been generally growing over the last 50 years. So yes, we should be investigating more about this. It is important, but we shouldn't be taking the little tip of this that's just opposite Tierra del Fuego as being telling us for the entire continent of Antarctica what's happening. And I would finish here with just a few summaries. Yeah, the IPCC, it's great at, if you want to find out the bits of evidence that say unusual warming, go to the IPCC report. If you want to get the full picture though, it's not good enough. You can't just pick the bits that agree with you. We all have that tendency to do that, but you have to look at every side. And that, for me, that's a big problem with the IPCC report, particularly the summary for policymakers, because the full reports give a lot more nuance, but the summary for policymaker report section, which is the bit that most people read, that's just, picking. It's just cherry picking the results that fit with the narrative. And in the computer model world, all of the climate change that we've seen since the 1950s is all due to greenhouse gases in the computer model world. But that doesn't tell us what's happening in the real world. You can use it as an analog, but you need to say, how are the models doing at simulating what's happening in the real world with these hindcasts? And so when you look at the hindcasts, well, I showed you, I'd gone through all of the regions of the cryosphere, and in every single aspect, my assessment is that the climate models are not up to task. So we shouldn't be using them for basing our, we can use them and just say, yeah, but what's the actual data saying? And what does the actual data saying? Well, it's saying the Arctic seems to alternate between periods, multi-decadal periods of warming and cooling. We had warming up to the 1930s, then cooling to the 1930s, 40s, then cooling to the 70s, then warming again. Maybe it's going to go warmer a bit more, then it go down a bit more. We had Nicholas was talking about maybe it'll cool down 2030 or 2050. If we wanted to do it, I would say we should be planning for warming or cooling. You can't just pick one. That would make more sense. Antarctic trends have been the opposite to the Arctic, but there has been some localized warming at the peninsula. But again, the data is very limited before 1957. So, TAC.